Hello and welcome to my presentation for the Questions of Accountability Conference. The title of my paper is The Accountability Deficit in Sortition. Is it a problem and what is the solution? And I'm Fred Motson. I'm a lecturer in law, also just commencing my PhD studies part-time with the Open University. And I'd always be keen to discuss these issues further with anyone, so please do feel free to contact me at my email address on screen, which is fred.motson@open.ac.uk. So increasing numbers of commentators talk about democracy being in crisis, or at least having a certain element of crisis, mainly related to a feeling of a lack of representativeness. And so this comes through a disconnect between people and politicians, a view, particularly in democracies like here in the UK, that there is a gulf really between professional politicians, the political class, and people in general, an idea that legislatures are not representative of the population as a whole on many grounds that might include sort of gender, race and religion, or more subtle gradations based around socioeconomic circumstances or background. And also a concern that elections are therefore not essentially doing their job, that the elections are not the be-all and end-all, that elections are heavily influenced by special interests, that the idea that elections provide accountability is questionable given voters tend to be relatively ignorant of individual representatives' voting record and work, that there have been corrosive effects of party politics, of increasing, it would seem, polarization, what's becoming a cliche, the idea that there is some kind of culture war. And I think particularly worth noting as well that party politics and electoral politics lead to presentism and short-termism, that there is a real emphasis on the now. And of course, if we only need to look at issues around our climate crisis to see what problems that kind of approach can lead to. So there have been more and more proposals in recent years for sortition to be used as an alternative means of selecting at least some of our politicians or those involved in our politics. By sortition, I'm essentially talking about a system where there is a random selection of people from a greater pool. This was something which dates right back to ancient Athens. Picture there of the device used where they would put metal plates with people's identities on to randomly select members of legislative and judicial bodies. And indeed, sortition has been used elsewhere, such as in Renaissance Italy. Indeed, it could be said up to the 18th century, and obviously particularly developments in France and the USA. In many ways, sortition was seen as a fundamental part of democracy, of rule by the demos, the people as a whole. In the last few centuries, we've obviously taken a different approach. We've considered democracy to be something which is achieved partly through electoral selection, but there are arguments that elections are inherently aristocratic, that there is an idea that elections are not really government by the people. They very much promote government by an elite on behalf of the people. And so, as I go into more detail explaining in my paper, there have been increasing numbers of proposals for lotocracies, legislature by lot, legislative bodies selected by sortition rather than election. And I would suggest there are 5 common features that tend to arise in all, or almost all at least, of these proposals. That we use sortition instead of election, or indeed instead of other methods. There are still bodies like the House of Lords where selection is not by election either. So we use sortition as a method of selecting at least some of the people involved in the legislature. That by sortition we mean random selection from a set pool of eligible people. Different proposals vary as to how narrowly or widely that pool is drawn, but most are probably similar to something like jury duty. We're talking about the vast majority of adults with sufficient mental capacity. Most proposals also assume that there will be some form of training and expert advice provided, that there will be some kind of compensation to make it plausible that people can join this body, whatever their life up to that point, and that those appointed will serve for a single set term. Often quite short terms are preferred, but not in all proposals. What I've focused on in this paper is one element of those proposals. I'm not looking at their workability in general, or how they would or could be brought into practice. I'm focusing on what I've called the democratic deficit. And here I've got a classic quote from the American judge Learned Hand, and a more modern interpretation of very similar principles by Christina Lafont, setting out that problem that essentially if you remove elections, you take away what for most citizens is their only real political power, their only real political control over the people who are acting on their behalf and who are making the law. And so in my research, what I've looked to try and do in my paper is to narrate and to categorize the different mechanisms that have been proposed to address this accountability deficit in a sort of chamber. And I've tried to take a wide definition of accountability. So what I'm looking at really are mechanisms which deal with any of the 4 sort of sensors which this definition by Helene Landemore brings forward. So whether that is political accountability to hold the rulers to account, whether that is sanctionability, the idea that of course in an electoral process there is the sanction of voting someone out of office, not re-electing them. Accountability in the sense of preventing outright corruption or bad behaviour, and accountability in the sense of responsiveness and good governance. So the mechanisms I look at may not necessarily address all of these elements, but they each in turn address at least one. And a large part of what I'm arguing in my paper is that it's important and useful to look at these mechanisms individually rather than as simply part of wider proposals, because a lot of the proposals, a lot of the writing in the area doesn't focus on accountability. It focuses on many facets of possibly introducing sortition. How would it work? How would we select the pool of people? How many people would we have? How long would they serve for? Where would this body sit in existing legislative systems? These are all important issues, but what I'm saying is that accountability needs to be looked at individually. And to help categorize that, I've essentially come up with a 2x2 matrix. So the 2 sort of factors which I've evaluated each mechanism by are whether it's vertical or horizontal. So that's used in the sense that O'Donnell and others have used it. Vertical being a mechanism where there is an imbalance of power between the people accounting and the people being held accountable. Horizontal where we're talking about two bodies of similar power or a similar position in the overall system. And I've also divided mechanisms into categories based on whether they're internal to the system or rely on actors external to the system or information external to the system. And that's led to these four categories. And in my paper, I give essentially a narrative account, attempting to be as systematic as possible, really, in categorizing all of the different mechanisms I've been able to identify through researching proposals for legislative sortition over the last couple of few decades. So obviously more detail provided in my paper and a lot more references to individual proposals. This is very much a top-down quick overview, but just to spin through those four categories, to highlight the overall categories, and then of course in my paper I've looked more specifically at what individual proposals have said under each of these headings. So internal vertical mechanisms, so mechanisms which are within the system but which rely on accountability moving vertically between a body with more power or more status than another. Four mechanisms there, one being political piety. This is the idea that those within the system will feel almost organically a sense of accountability, a sense of responsiveness, a sense of responsibility to the wider public. There's no external accounting, it's internal in the sense that this is purely in the minds of those in the sortition chamber, but it's a vertical mechanism because it's considered an accountability to the people, the public at large, or even just simply the nation or the constituency for which these people consider themselves responsible. That is quite an informal mechanism, although it's one that a lot of writers do touch on. A much more formal mechanism would be accountability upwards within the system to some kind of oversight committee. There are issues with that. There is the sort of issue of infinite regression, who watches the watchers. There is the issue of concentrating power, but there is the idea that any system is going to require these kinds of checks and balances, and it's probably something that for those more used to systems where there are these vertical monitoring systems already, perhaps an idea that comes more naturally than somewhere like the UK system, where we don't tend to have a constitutional court or those kinds of mechanisms that have an almost vertical oversight. The other two mechanisms are more limitations on the power of the body, and this is why I wanted to take as wide a definition as I could. I didn't just want to look at individual mechanisms in the sense of something you can add to a system, but anything you can do with a system, with a proposal that reduces the accountability deficit. And so one way of reducing the deficit is an outright system of accountability like an oversight committee. Another way is to limit the power, to have a bicameral rather than unicameral system where there is also an electoral body, and there is the chance to make the electoral body superior to the extent that it is vertically above the sortition body in the system. And I identify two main ways in which different proposals achieve that, either by making the sortition body purely advisory, or by giving it some decisive power, but only a negative power, only the power to veto proposals from the electoral body, no power to initiate law, to set the agenda themselves. Moving swiftly on, internal horizontal mechanisms, bicameralism again, and this is one of the reasons why I think these categories are helpful. I think a lot of the existing literature just talks about, well, these proposals are bicameral proposals, but my argument is there is a big distinction between a bicameral proposal where the sortition body is inferior and one where the sortition chamber is equal or almost equal. And the reason I distinguish those latter two categories is that some writers have entirely equal chambers, others will give one chamber essentially the power to break deadlock. An alternative, an interesting one, is a mixed chamber, having a unilateral chamber but having part or some of those legislators chosen by election, some by sortition. Others argue rather than less, we should have more, multiple body sortition. Terrell Borsasos in America certainly does a lot on that. Judicial review, another option, having judicial oversight. And peer accountability, accountability literally within the chamber. Moving on to external mechanisms. Not many external horizontal mechanisms because there aren't really many external actors equal to the legislature. I've included scrutiny procedures here, particularly post-appointment. A number of proposals have mechanisms that, for example, say financial monitoring of ex-sortition legislators for a number of years. I think they have to be considered external because these people have left the system, but horizontal in the sense that the monitoring, the accountability is at the same level rather than by a different body with a different status. And referenda, making the people as powerful essentially, and saying that the sortition body operates as an agenda setting, law drafting body, but that the people themselves essentially act as a second house, as a bicameral system, where decisions are only made after a referendum. Finally, probably the most detailed category, external vertical mechanisms, mainly really talking here about accountability from those in power to those they govern. The ancient Greeks used court actions for this. Perhaps the modern alternative is recall procedures, such as in California, although not necessarily that comparable, as I go into more depth in my paper. Public reputation, considered very powerful, and media accountability. And this really comes into this idea of the duty to account. What do we mean by accountability? Is accountability about sanctions, or is it about explaining and giving reasons? And I think this links into work done outside of the sortition space, or the specifically sortition space, such as Keynes' idea of the monetary democracy. And also, finally, the idea that just because people are randomly selected, that's no reason they couldn't still have constituents. And in fact, we could be more inventive with our constituents. Someone could be accountable to people like them rather than simply people of a geographic area. You could even have accountability, representation of those who are currently unrepresented, like future generations. So very briefly, what have I learned from my research thus far? I think I set out to explain why I think we need to detach mechanisms from the systems that they're contained within. And I think that remains true, that there is a need for a pick and mix kind of approach if we're going to see a sortition selected legislative body at any point. I think the two key points of contention are that are particular issues across the literature are how much we rely on formal as opposed to informal accountability, and how much privacy we respect of the members of the legislature compared to openness and transparency, and that can affect a number of the mechanisms I've already mentioned. And I think probably ideally more focused research is required on real-life examples. Thank you very much for attending my virtual presentation.